Hi guys, it's me, William Angel, and welcome back to my Family Guy review series. This time I am doing every episode of Season 14. Season 13 was not particularly enjoyable, but was still a slight improvement from Season 12, which was rock bottom for the show pretty much. I hope this season continues to improve, even if it is only gradual improvement. In general, the fan consensus of this period of Family Guy is a bit interesting, I have found. Not many sing its praises, but there are some people of the opinion that these mid-teen seasons do keep slowly getting better. So that's something I will monitor, of course, as I go, and I'll keep you informed where I stand. For now though, that's the introduction over. Let's get into these episodes. Season 14, Episode 1, Pilling Them Softly. Quagmire gets his own cooking show, and he brings in Peter for support. However, he soon regrets his decision. Meanwhile, Brian and Stewie get hooked on ADHD pills. Peter cheering people on at NASCAR doubles up here as both my favourite cutaway and overall moment. The season opener gets a 2 out of 5. To touch on the Peter Quagmire cooking war first, I think it failed mainly because it never gave us anyone to root for. Quagmire was being so narcissistic at the start that he became instantly unlikable, and when Peter pretty much sabotaged his show, he was unlikable as well. So I had no investment in the story, other than maybe wanting them both to fail. But that is not what happened at the cook-off. We had Peter giving up in what was, in my opinion, a pretty hollow attempt at a happy ending. The subplot tried to make a satirical point about ADHD medication and how it is often pushed on kids. On this channel, I have a few times praised the Simpsons episode Brother's Little Helper for its take on this issue, which I think was far more subtle and effective than this episode's attempt. I think this would be better served using Chris for the role, rather than Stewie, given that he has had issues with hyper behaviour in the past. All that happened here is Stewie and later Brian getting whacked out on the stuff, and Brian uses his new energy to write a crappy script, which gets rejected by George R. Martin, or rather a clone of George R. Martin. That's about as random as it sounds. Overall, these two plots were disappointing, and the jokes never made up for it. Peter yelling, "Go round in circles, advertise things, go round in circles," at the NASCAR event was the moment I found funniest. And even that wasn't amazingly funny, just a rather accurate description of what NASCAR is all about. Season 14, Episode 2, Papa Has a Rollin' Son. Peter and the guys plan a reunion for Joe and his father, but when Joe tells them he hates the handicapped, Peter pretends to be Joe to keep his disability a secret. My best cutaway was Peter working as a break-up rodeo clown, and best overall moment was the ending. This one gets a 4 out of 5. This type of story does fit the Family Guy profile. Peter tries to help his friend in some kind of wacky way, only to get carried away by it and cause problems for his friend instead. Most of the time this doesn't work out so good. It usually ends up with Peter becoming incredibly unlikable and there being an unsatisfying ending. This time only one of those two boxes were checked. Peter was a bit of a jackass, of course, essentially trying to steal Joe's father away from him, but this time we actually had a satisfying ending. Not only did Joe get payback on Peter by beating him up, his father actually responded to finding out Joe was handicapped in a reasonable way. He admitted that his mindset was in the wrong, and while he still has a lot of learning to do, he said he will try his best to accept Joe as his son. I wasn't expecting a feel-good type of ending here, I have to say, but it was a welcome change. It's also quite realistic for a lot of people in real life who have tried to get acceptance from their parents for something about their lifestyle their parents might not be typically approving of. The subplot with Stewie and little Tom Cruise was okay, but nothing memorable. They mostly just made fun of his height and some of his general weirdness, which again is fine, but it's also a low-hanging fruit. What really made this episode enjoyable was I found it very funny. Peter as this rodeo clown, acting like a matador to a bull, worked well, but I also liked Rudolph the uncircumcised reindeer, and Stewie being the weird karate guy in front of the mirror, and even a dark humour one of Peter telling the couple that it's not breathing. The non-cutaway moment I found funniest was Dr. Hartman and Lois discussing the apparently fake boobs of his last patient. Who cares indeed, Dr. Hartman? Season 14, Episode 3, Guy Robot. Stewie builds a robot pal to make Brian jealous, and Peter and Lois get a new mattress. My best cutaway here was the requirements to get a jet ski license, and the best moment overall was the 1950s insane asylum. This one gets a 3 out of 5. Now, Stewie does have a right to be pissed at Brian for stealing his jokes without even asking, but him creating this robot baby friend to replace Brian was a very odd way of going about things. I don't think much of it really. The robot was not that entertaining, and it was obvious Brian and Stewie would destroy them all in the end. So most of the time was wasted on Stewie just hanging out with the robot. The Lois and Peter mattress subplot was equally flat, even flatter than their mattress, but at least it brought us the scene with the old doctor at the asylum. It was dark for sure, especially given how all that stuff did actually go on back then with horrifying regularity, but that's what makes it work as a piece of dark humour for me. There were some other decent jokes here, like the jet ski test being, have you ever got into a fight with one of your many stepdads? You also have Meg being kidnapped by Buffalo Bill, and Peter apparently not caring. So yeah, not the most memorable episode, but I still found it just about okay overall. Season 14, Episode 4, Peternormal Activity. Things go horribly wrong when the guys try to come up with a horror film. Also, Stewie is annoyed by Brian's new glasses. My best cutaway here was the evil bar of soap, and the best moment was Peter getting the knife, then putting it back while Lois was talking. This one gets a 4 out of 5. I was definitely into the idea here, with Peter and his friends trying to write their own horror movie after seeing a terrible one. Things develop in a nice way too, in how they go to this creepy, deserted mansion to try and come up with ideas. There are a lot of nice references to the horror genre, and the ideas they come up with themselves are also great, especially the rather cinematic evil bar of soap. The bits where they freak out thinking a murderer is after them was okay. The bit where they kill this supposed war hero was a bit graphic, but the ending twist with that guy worked well enough. The subplot, however, leaves a lot to be desired. I don't care about smug Brian with his glasses, and too much time is spent on Stewie trying to stop him wearing them. The only thing which makes me give it a pass is the out of nowhere ending, where Stewie smacks him in the face with a baseball bat. Brian's yelling about the glass in his eye really puts the slapstick over the top. This is another episode I found to be on the funny side. Quite a few nice jokes, like the totally silly Johnny wind chimes, Peter as a monster cat, Meg denying taking a dump in the shower, as well as the weirdly specific song, which had all the lyrics about what Peter and the guys did. And of course, my favourite, Lois telling Peter she knows what he did, leading to Peter drawing the knife. Then he puts it back when it was just about the washing up. But wait, he draws it again when she left some of it for him to do. Just a very well crafted joke, that one. Overall, this was close to a 5. Had the subplot either been removed or cut down to a few scenes, it probably would have got there. Season 14, Episode 5, Peter, Chris and Brian. When Peter realizes he's done nothing with his life, he tries to fix Chris. However, Brian butts in and tries to teach Chris himself. My best cutaway here was Peter's walk like an Egyptian phase, and best moment was teenage Peter's message to his older self. This one gets a 3 out of 5. Peter realizing that he didn't live up to his ambitions and not wanting Chris to end up a failure like him is a believable concept and one which could have made for great drama. They never took full advantage of it. I mean, some of the bits in the first half where Peter was genuinely trying to help Chris was good to see, and I did like the enthusiasm of teenage Peter's speech, as well as the Conway Twitty reference. The bit where they make up for the ending, while predictable, did feel like somewhat of a genuine connection. However, when Brian takes over teaching Chris, it developed into exactly the type of pretentious nonsense you might expect. The comedy suddenly dripped from the episode as we had to endure them hanging out, as Peter watched on sad about the situation. It took up almost the entire second half of the episode too. It's a shame really, because the cutaways here were great, almost across the board. You have fat guys thinking fish and chips is a diet food. As someone from England, who naturally has eaten quite a lot of fish and chips, I can confirm they are definitely not. There's also Moses being a fraud, using the commandments to get first place in line to eat, Peter being easily influenced by song, and his ill-fated trip to Las Vegas. My favourite of all though was Peter doing the Egyptian walk after speaking at a funeral. I just found that such a funny visual. Overall, this episode was really close to a 4. Had the second half of the episode been even decent, it would have easily got there. Season 14, Episode 6, Peter's Sister. Peter's sister comes to visit for Thanksgiving, but Peter never told his family that she has a history of bullying him. I have the same best cutaway and moment here, which was Peter lying to the cab driver about living in the White House. This one gets a 3 out of 5. There were some weird things going on in the storytelling department here, but the episode scrapes by on a few scattered funny moments. Peter having this big butch wrestling sister was quite the turn up for the books. It's never even been hinted at on the show before. The idea of him being bullied by her in his childhood could have been really interesting. It might well explain a few things about his personality. However, they never tried to dive deep into why it was happening. Karen, of course that's her name by the way, never gave a reason as to why she was bullying Peter, so we're just left to assume she's a bad person. Peter seemingly doesn't want to mend their relationship either. He ignores all the advice to have a talk with her in favour of going into this crazy women's wrestling match. The ending was also a bit of a miss for me. Meg saves Peter, and the episode tries to draw some parallels with the abuse Peter gives Meg. It doesn't come across as anything genuine, and the fact that Peter refuses to help Karen after Meg's chair shot leaves her in a coma proves that he didn't learn any lessons at all. As I said though, the jokes pick up the story's slack. I love the whole Steven Seagal exchange. What are you? He fat. Way to not mince your words, Cleveland. Again, the cutaways here were above average. The Muhammad Ali one was quite brutal. The alternate incest ending to Back to the Future was a bit disturbing, and Stewie's green energy drink was downright crazy. But the White House gag I enjoyed so much. The taxi guy insisting on seeing it for himself was funny, but the way Peter and the Secret Service guy both commit to the ruse was hilarious. Season 14, Episode 7, Hot Pocket Dial. Quagmire pocket dials Peter while he was in the middle of professing his love for Lois. My best cutaway for this one is Lois taking Peter to Auschwitz, and my best moment overall was Lois, Peter and Quagmire trying to find a way, some way to go back to normal. This one gets a 4 out of 5. The story here was quite solid, but there was one aspect I was not so sure about. I have never really got the impression from watching this series that Quagmire actually does have any genuine feelings for Lois. Now I'm sure he would sleep with her if given the chance, yes. That's just Quagmire. But would he actually want to settle down and spend his life with Lois? Quagmire settle down. It doesn't quite pass the sniff test for me. And does he even genuinely believe she is this kind, loving person? It is all a bit far-fetched for me. It's nothing like Brian falling in love with Lois in the early seasons, which did actually feel believable. Once you look past that obstacle though, the rest of the episode has some decent moments and conversations between the characters. They were all acting like they should given the situation. The awkward tension could be felt through the screen. The talk between them all at the end was especially good. Lois was spot on. It's only natural for people to have some unsavory thoughts, which they never act on or tell anyone about. And we even tend to look the other way when friends and acquaintances do something or have an opinion we don't agree with, just for the sake of getting along without hassle. So the story ended up being a net positive, despite my initial hang-ups. The jokes here were also good. Peter and his pheasant on the glass was quite the show. Then you have Joe recalling the time he went parasailing, resulting in him losing the bottom half of his legs, which were then retrieved by a grateful mermaid, at least the fish part of her. But the most memorable was the Disney one. It was a cliche joke about Walt Disney, sure, I'll give you that, but the "don't go on the train ride" was a great line to cap it off. Season 14, Episode 8, Brokeback Swanson. Joe gets paralyzed from the neck down. This results in Bonnie leaving him and his friends putting him in a home. Meanwhile, Brian pretends to be a guy's dog in order to sleep with his wife. My best cutaway here was Peter failing to fit in at Hogwarts, and best moment was Joe competing at the bull run. This one gets a 2 out of 5. This was one of those Family Guy episodes you get from time to time, where everything felt so devoid of morals, and even genuine human emotion. It makes it hard to get behind the characters, which had the knock-on effect of making me feel disconnected from the episode, like nothing mattered. Let's start off with the Joe stuff. There were some decent bits at the start, where he tries to make a go at the bull competition, but sadly for him, his wheelchair gets tripped up and he ends up getting trampled by the bulls, leaving him almost fully paralyzed. This leads to Bonnie outright leaving him for good. She never returns in this episode, although I suppose she'll be back for the next one like nothing happened. His friends treat him no better. They basically abandon him by sticking him in the worst care home imaginable. They don't even do anything to make things right for the ending. Everything is resolved by the rather odd twist of Dr. Hartman's phone being lodged in Joe's spine. It was an attempt at a funny moment to wrap up the story, but it didn't really work for me. The subplot is probably worse. It was again Brian acting like a horny little SOB, and he hooks up with this cheating young woman. Neither of them are in the right, of course, but the episode doesn't really acknowledge that. If anything, it paints the Navy SEAL in a bad light. The ending of Joe Biden of all people showing up and getting the guy to give Brian back to the Griffins also felt like, sure, whatever. Although I did like the line, which implied that the US never actually killed Osama bin Laden after all. There were at least a few jokes I found funny here. The trapped baseball announcer, with his sarcastic comments, was one, as well as a few of Dr. Hartman's lines. but Peter being called out as a sex offender by the Hogwarts sorting hat was my fave. The disappointed he gives really sells the gag. Season 14, Episode 9, A Shot in the Dark. Peter accidentally shoots Cleveland Jr. and it gets branded as a hate crime. My best cutaway was the speed sign telling Peter he is fat. And my best moment was the way Cleveland dealt with the media by telling them he shot his son. I gave this one a 4 out of 5. Now, Peter shooting Cleveland's son could have gone in a number of directions. It could have gone the character route, where they get into the relationship between Peter and the Browns, but it never did. Cleveland's son vanished from the story towards the end, and the only real conflict they have is rooted in what they perceive as racial bias. That is the crux of the story, really. It's attempting to satire the idea of hate crimes, and touches a bit on race relations in the United States. I think they did a good job of it in the main. I'm personally not in agreement of hate crime laws in general. To me, a crime is a crime, regardless of your motives for doing it. Sure, you might say that premeditated murder, for example, is worse than murder which just happens spontaneously, but once you actually plan out a crime, your motives kind of are irrelevant to me at that point. So I am on board with the episode when it suggests that the media milks the hell out of this stuff whenever it happens. Call me cynical, but I think they do it on purpose. It makes a much better story for them if they act like there is some massive fighting going on between the races. And even politicians are happy to stoke the flames as well. It's classic divide and rule tactics, which is never a good thing for humanity. Cleveland was real smooth. He was not only a swell guy for forgiving Peter and realizing that he is indeed not a racist, he also got the media to tuck their tails between their legs and run away after making it about black on black crime. That's another bit of truth right there. There were a few funny moments here too. The car one I already mentioned, and Joe has 2 good moments all to himself. First, you have his rather sad attempt at small talk. Then you have Peter asking him who the boys upstairs are, and Joe says, "I don't know, there's no elevator." I found that incredibly funny for some reason. Season 14, Episode 10, Candy Quahog Marshmallow. The guys discover that Quagmire was a Korean soap opera star and traveled to Korea to try and track down the last episode. While there, Quagmire reconnects with his love interest from the show. My best cutaway was Peter's dream of becoming a half-man, half-horse. And best moment was the K-pop song Peter, Cleveland and Joe perform to try and convince Quagmire to come back to America. I gave this one a 3 out of 5. As it pertains to the general direction of the story, I did enjoy this, mainly because of their antics in Korea, and just how into Quagmire's old show the other guys get. Now sure, this is yet another crazy thing Quagmire has done in his life. The show just keeps adding more and more backstory, and will continue to do so in the future. It removes any chance at realism, but you kind of have to expect that with the show at this point anyway. The ending did feel a tad rushed. It was obvious Quagmire would have this last minute change of heart and go back to America, but the take on the Korean pop song was quite catchy, so it made up for it. This wasn't as funny as some of the previous episodes, but it was still fine. The image of Peter's legs on a horse's body was comical by itself, and the German film studio after World War II was also decent. Season 14, Episode 11, Lee Peanut Butter Kid. Stewie snags a starring role in a national commercial and soon gets lots of commercial work. However, Peter and Lois start pushing him too hard in pursuit of making him a child actor. My best cutaway here was when Godzilla attacked Haiti, and best moment was Stewie's way of getting fired from the commercial. I gave this one a 2 out of 5. This started out okay, with Peter and his metal detector. It was nothing special, but there were a few good moments there, like Peter meeting Adam West in this void type place. But once Stewie got into acting in commercials, things followed the typical Family Guy script, that being Peter and Lois do something bad to their kids, only for the person on the receiving end to finally snap back at them, resulting in them giving a half-assed apology. It's not very inspiring stuff. It's also a fairly realistic portrayal of how this happens in real life. There are plenty of parents who will push their kids too hard, even at the detriment of their own health. As the episode points out, Hollywood does not have a great track record of treating child actors well. At least Brian cared about Stewie's well-being on this occasion. The advice he gives to Stewie to get himself fired resulted in an amusing moment. The way he rips the woman's shirt open and tries to take a dump in the orange juice. But this wasn't great cutaway-wise. The only one I liked was the darkish one about Godzilla going to attack Haiti, only to find it already destroyed. Season 14, Episode 12, Scammed Yankees. Peter and Carter end up in Nigeria when they fall prey to a scam. Meanwhile, Brian tries to get with Patty after seeing her body while she was changing. My best cutaway was the guy on his wedding day, and best moment was Peter's imperative phone call and pictures that he risks getting shot to look at. Never mind Carter getting scammed, I feel a bit scammed here. This one gets a 1 out of 5. Now, unlike many 1-rated episodes, there were a few decent moments here, like Peter's insistence that he looks at his phone, and the ants at a picnic. I especially liked the guy's comments. As he's leaving the church on his wedding day, he knew exactly what he would be losing out on. And the final line, "See ya later, money," was very well delivered. Still, those moments could not quite save this episode from a 1 because both plotlines were quite bad. Firstly, Brian hitting on Patty only for her body was a bad move on the face of it, but the fact she is Meg's high school friend just made it creepy, and he doesn't get enough comeuppance for his actions to make the ending satisfying. The Peter Carter stuff was in equally bad taste. They made a ton of jokes at Africa's expense, but they weren't clever jokes. They were just straight up about Ebola and mosquitoes and kids working in diamond mines. No comedic spin on them, they were just presented as a part of normal African life. As you can imagine, this did not help the tone of the episode, and when you combine that with Carter's wishy-washy U-turn at the end, it was all rendered pointless as well as annoying. Season 14, Episode 13, An App a Day. Chris becomes a sex offender after sending a girl a picture of his penis. Meanwhile, Brian joins Stewie in a doubles tennis tournament. My best cutaway here was the self-serve checkout tricking Chris into suffocating himself. And best moment was Stewie's rant at the umpire for calling his shot out. I gave this one a 2 out of 5. So the main plot here didn't make much sense. Neil basically convinces Chris to send a dick pic to a girl he likes. Of course that is inappropriate, but it's nothing too outrageous for high school students. That kind of thing definitely does go on, but here the police got involved and declare the whole thing as child pornography. That makes very little sense, and is certainly an overreaction. Because of this, Chris gets registered as a sex offender and has to attend these creepy classes with Quagmire of all people as the leader. Then he goes through a whole phase of chemical castration before he goes crumbling back to normal. The whole thing is a bit of a mess, and the ending even acknowledges that there was no real message behind any of it. The subplot was slightly better without being good. Brian was once again annoying. Almost the only thing he's about these days is acting like a douche to try and get with random women. It's been beaten to death by this point, so I have nothing new to comment on it. However, Stewie playing tennis was okay, and as I say, I did like his explosive rant at the umpire. I think he was right, by the way. His shot looked in to me. Season 14, Episode 14, Underage Peter. After Peter goes on a drunken rampage, Mayor West raises the legal drinking age to 50. To get around this, Peter and the guys get Brian to buy beer for them. My best cutaway was, what would have happened if Thomas Edison had given up? And my best moment was just the bits of Peter and Brian hanging out. So Prohibition, fully under 50s, got a rating of 3 out of 5. This definitely had a ridiculous premise. A law saying only 50-year-olds and above could drink alcohol would never happen, let's be real. Despite that silliness, the actual core story was solid. The character stuff, with Brian helping the guys get beer, because he is technically 56 in dog years, was quite clever, I thought. And even though they did have a rough patch here, I still like it whenever Peter and Brian team up and have some fun together. Always an underrated part of the show for me. It was also nice to see Carol with Mayor West again, and she actually had some plot relevance here, as she was seen drinking wine while being underage, which would allow Peter and Brian to kind of blackmail Mayor West. Now, it wasn't too prevalent, but for whatever it's worth, there was a hint of satire here, just with the implication that there will always be people who find a way to use loopholes in order to get their hands on whatever the government has taken from them. There's a reason why things like the war on drugs, for example, never end up working as they claim it's intended. So yeah, unlike most of the episodes this season, it was the story here which did most of the heavy lifting, because the episode wasn't that funny. There were a few okay cutaways I will mention. The boiling pot, so many sexual innuendos packed in there, Peter lying about having a 13-inch penis, while a guy was having a heart attack, and how everyone in the restaurant is more interested in Peter and stand up to applaud him. And of course the jab at Edison stealing people's inventions was very much warranted. Season 14, Episode 15. A lot going on upstairs. Brian travels inside Stewie's mind to try and find out why he is having nightmares. My best cutaway was the sleeping cartoon sheriff Peter is able to sneak past. And best moment was Stewie messing up the opening by forgetting his lines. This one gets a 4 out of 5. A character having nightmares is obviously not an original concept, but it is, to my memory at least, original for this show. They make the most out of it too. Some of these situations Stewie imagines himself in are very entertaining. Him messing up the intro was great. I like how he tried his best to bluff his way through it, and how he acknowledged Joe getting halfway up the stairs. The bits with him and Brian confronting this shadow-type monster not only had some nice visuals and animation, it also had a decent twist at the end. The twist being that the monster in Stewie's mind was actually Brian. Not for any bad thing Brian has done to him, but because Stewie has a fear of letting him down. This is an interesting angle of Stewie's psyche, because we know deep down he does actually value Brian's opinion, and even sees him like a bit of a father figure. This leads to a nice scene to wrap up, where Brian tells Stewie that he is proud of him, and he has nothing to worry about. The subplot where Peter and the guys are fooling around in the attic, and Lois locks them up there, was some simple fun. I liked all their goofing around, and how in the end both sides were willing to admit that they went too far. In general, this episode had the characters acting more like actual human beings, more so than the average Modern Family Guy episode anyway. The only thing which stopped this being a 5 is that I never found it all that funny. A lot of what was happening on screen was somewhat entertaining, as I said. It's just that the actual jokes themselves never hit as hard as a lot of other episodes this season. Season 14, Episode 16, The Heartbreak Dog. Brian shares a kiss with Bonnie at her 46th birthday party. After Joe finds out, they end up running away together. My best cutaway was Brian discovering Peter's hidden shame at being a bike person. He's crossed over to the dark side now. My best moment was Joe finding out Bonnie cheated with Brian through Peter doing charades. This one gets a 2 out of 5. So up front, I am slightly biased against this episode, solely for the fact that I'm so numb to Joe and Bonnie's depressing relationship that at this point, even if a story about it was well done, I would struggle to feel any emotion from it. It's not like this was particularly well done. After Brian and Bonnie have their little kiss, the next half of the episode was Joe getting carried away with getting his payback, his revenge on Brian, by having his car towed, literally drugging him, etc. This doesn't help his likability. Meanwhile, Brian and Bonnie are just silly here. How they just up and run away, with no plan for their future. Bonnie is especially scummy, given that she even leaves her baby at home. When Joe finally catches up with them, thanks to a microchip that was in Brian, he does say all the right things about maybe taking Bonnie for granted and wanting to work on their marriage. However, he basically silently admitted that Bonnie has it so bad with him that she was almost forced to cheat. That is not grounds to build a successful relationship on, is it? It's more than enough to win Bonnie over though. I really wish this is the last episode about these two and their problems. We have had 2 instances of it this season, and it was a mess both times. The subplot of Chris and Meg stealing from the old folks' home was just kind of there. It felt more like filler than anything else. Certainly no lessons were learned from it. This was below average in terms of good jokes. But I did like Joe shooting Brian at the end, after he smugly tried to take credit for them getting back together. And Peter and Joe combining to reveal the whole thing during charades was also quite funny. It's like they had some kind of telepathic understanding. Season 14, Episode 17, Take a Letter. Lois becomes a postal worker and finds an old letter Peter wrote to an ex-girlfriend just before their wedding. Meanwhile, Stewie has to pretend he is rich to win over his new classmates. My best cutaway here was the Peter catcher, and my best moment was how Lois outsmarted and defeated Gretchen. I gave this one a 4 out of 5. As a change of pace, let's talk about Stewie's subplot first. There isn't much to analyse anyway. It was just a cliche sitcom type setup where Stewie befriends a rich kid and has to pretend to be rich himself. He somehow manages to seize someone's mansion while they were away to throw a party for all the other kids. This was all okay, but he inevitably got found out in the end, in a rather abrupt manner. Still, I did like the ending line, "It's not because you're poor, it's because you lied to us and you're poor." The main plot took a while to get going, and it too went in a rather predictable direction. Peter's ex-love interest turned out to be a total psycho who tries to kill Lois to get him all to herself. The story just ticked along for the most part, with the odd good gag here and there, mostly with Lois working with Cleveland at the post office. But the ending was what I really liked. Lois pretended to be offended by Peter's old letter, to trick Gretchen, only for her to come back and beat her up. It was not only a clever thing to do, but it was also mature for her not to hold it against Peter. As she said, they both felt a bit uneasy going into their marriage, but they went through with it and are somehow still together. So maybe that counts for something. It worked as a relatively happy ending, instead of the usual marriage drama we get. This was also reasonably funny. The crackling fire to punctuate uncomfortable family revelations was very well worded. Testicles was a funny gag, although is that any different to any man really? At least his balls are his only weakness. The Peter catcher was my favourite though. Not only was it a nice chitty chitty bang bang reference, I also totally buy that Peter would fall for it. He knew exactly what he was going to be in for as well. Season 14, Episode 18, The New Adventures of Old Tom. Tom is getting upstaged by a younger reporter, so Peter tries to help him get the attention back. However, it backfires, resulting in Tom getting fired. My best cutaway here was Peter's appearance on The Voice. And best moment overall was the other guy who was looking for Lois at the mall. I gave this one a 3 out of 5. This was not entirely original. We have had Tom Tucker losing his job and being led astray by Peter before, so this didn't do much to stand out. But at least it was good how Peter got Tom his job back in the end, by twisting the situation and making out that he was going to be the one to jump, and allowing Tom, and only Tom, to talk him down. I enjoyed the intro scenes at the mall a bit more, especially Peter's fascination with the train, and the guy shouting for Lois. His reasoning being that if Lois is with a guy like Peter, then he has a shot with her. He might not be wrong either, because given some of Lois's lines in this episode, she really couldn't care less about Peter. The subplot was more of Brian's shenanigans. I find it funny how the show doesn't even acknowledge how shallow he is anymore. It's just taken as a given that he will be lying in some form to try and sleep with any decent looking woman he encounters. It's so overdone at this point, it's a joke. There were a few funny moments here. Tom Tucker announcing his own birth in a newsreader type fashion was a great little cutaway. And Peter's sob story on The Voice is exactly what happens on those type of shows. Season 14, Episode 19, Run Chris Run. Chris becomes the homecoming king at school, but Stewie and Brian discover that the other students are only giving him the title out of pity. My best cutaway was Stewie's camping trip with One Direction, and my best moment was Peter forcing the guys to play Tecmo Bowl. This episode is about as successful for me as Chris's run as king. It gets a 2 out of 5. Now, there was nothing inherently wrong with the premise of either plot, but they both came with some annoyances to stop them becoming good. Let's start with Chris getting a fake king title from his school peers. It was a bit annoying how egotistical Chris got because of it, but that didn't last too long, and at least we got a savage line from Stewie out of it. Unfortunately, Brian had to get in a few pervy moments, like trying to go into the girls' school bathroom and commenting on how hot the girl who was killed in a car crash was. Also, it was pretty misguided for the whole school to take pity on Chris, not because he was a loser, but because they thought he was mentally ill. The ending had Chris finally coming to his senses. He rightly recognised that he didn't need anyone's pity. And frankly, that is a good message in general. Even if someone has certain mental struggles or mental disabilities, the right approach isn't pitying them and pandering to them, treating them as actual human beings, as you would anyone else, I would think is the better approach. The subplot had Cleveland getting annoyed at the guys, abandoning him, leaving him with Latab, so he starts to hang out with Jerome instead. The guys rather stupidly assume they are only hanging out because they are both black. Well, actually it's not stupid because that's exactly what Jerome admits to doing. I don't see what the point of any of this was, really. I mean, as a general rule, I think a lot of people do tend to stick to their own kind. There is a reason why different communities form, after all, different pockets of society. They often do form across racial lines before anything else. All races do this throughout history, and while I don't think this is ideal behaviour necessarily, I'm also not willing to call it racist. It's just human nature. The majority of people are like it to some extent. By the majority, I just mean more than 50%. I think I'm fair in making that general observation. Anyway, I'm giving this episode more thought than it actually deserves because it was very shallow in the way it went about things. It wasn't great jokes-wise either. Chris's first kiss was decent, as was Peter abusing the pace of Bo Jackson on Tecmo Bowl. The double dribble clip, however, actually brought Fox a bit of controversy over a YouTuber having his original gameplay footage taken down over a copyright claim. Not the best look there, but they sorted it out in the end. In fact, Seth MacFarlane even got involved in the incident on Twitter. Season 14, Episode 20, Road to India. Brian falls in love with a technical support representative from India, so he decides to make a trip to the country to be with her. My best cutaway here was Peter timing his farts to a thunderstorm, and the best moment was Brian's appearance on the Indian version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. The season finale gets a 3 out of 5. This was below average by Road 2 standards, but by general standards, I think average would sum this episode up quality-wise. It took a while to get going. The first third of the episode was just Brian talking to this Indian girl on the phone. Even when they do finally get to India, a lot of time is spent on Indian stereotypes, like crowded streets, and buses, and a horrid smell as soon as they leave the airport. They even make a joke about the red dot, which a lot of Hindus have, being a shutdown button. It was fine, but I did prefer the joke about it in the early seasons, where Peter thought it was a sniper's dot. Things did pick up a bit when Brian first met Padma, with the whole arranged marriage dilemma. She seemed like a nice person, which is rare for this show, and because of that, her with Brian didn't come across as instantly off-putting. Of course, they would not stay together in the end, but at least there were a few good moments along the way. First among them was Brian on Millionaire. I did actually know the answer to his question, being somewhat of a cricket fan. Honestly, even for non-Indians, if you are a sports fan, there is a good chance you have at least heard of Sachin Tendulkar. MS Dhoni is a decent batter as well though, to be fair. The side plot didn't really need to be here. It was just Peter butting in on Joe's bingo. He was a jerk for the most part, but his cutaway of farting in a thunderstorm is for me a top tier cutaway for the show as a whole, so that somewhat makes up for the bad stuff. Overall, this was a decent way to end the season. So that's all the season 14 episodes discussed. Now let's talk a little about the season as a whole. Its overall average score was 2.9, which is again an improvement on last time. My bottom 5 episodes were Pilling Them Softly at 5, Brokeback Swanson at 4, The Peanut Butter Kid at 3, An App a Day at 2, and Scammed Yankees was the lone 1-rated episode. My top 5, which were all 4 out of 5s, Papa Has a Rolling Sun at 5, Take a Letter at 4, Hot Pocket Dial at 3, Peternormal Activity at 2, and my favourite of all was A Lot Going On Upstairs. As you might have been able to tell if you've watched a decent chunk of this video, I do indeed think this season is another decent step up. I view this season as kind of average overall. I mean, the rating suggests it was on the bad side of average, but honestly I found this season fairly easy to sit through. The worst episodes here weren't that bad. Only one episode got the bottom marks. Now you can flip that. There wasn't many episodes here you will be rushing to watch again. Certainly none which fall into the classic Family Guy territory. But there were a lot of genuine, average/good episodes. This, combined with the large amount of 3 out of 5s, just made it so the season never annoyed me, and I will absolutely take that situation at this point in the show's run. In terms of any general themes this season, I already mentioned that Brian's lone character trait these days is trying to pick up women through scummy means. That was probably the worst thing about the season, but there were also a few episodes about Joe's depressing life and failing marriage to Bonnie. I have had enough of that storyline for the time being. Hopefully it doesn't show up again next season. But the other characters were all mostly fine. This was one of Peter's calmest years in a while. He had the odd moment of course, but in general they did seem to tone him down a little. They certainly cut back on the amount of episode plots, only about his wacky shenanigans. Another more subtle thing I noticed while watching is the amount of references and jokes about autism and Asperger's. I think nothing of them really, they are just kind of there. But it was noticeable to me how many there were, and if I am noticing it, it probably is too many. Anyway, I've said all I can say about this season. If you have any questions or want to share your own opinions about this Family Guy season, please leave them in the comments. If you also want to leave a like and a subscribe while you're down there, I would very much appreciate it. Catch you all later, take care,